Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Vittorian, and this is the 25th hour helping you remember everything that happened beyond the 24/7 news cycle. We have a lot to talk about when it comes to the rest of this year. January is almost over, and it feels like half the year has already gone by. Mayor Eric Adams is in full swing trying to staff his administration and implement public safety measures that he campaigned on. COVID is still a threat, but we're starting on the downward slope from the latest Omicron variant. And we are seeing a female majority city council and the first female governor chart a new path for New York City and New York State. Joining me today to talk about looking forward in 2022 is Ben Max, executive editor of the Gotham Gazette. Listeners may know Ben as an opinion leader on Twitter, prognosticating about all things NYC, or as host of the Max Politics podcast, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. But for those of you who don't know Ben, he didn't actually start off as a big shot journalist. He started off as a high school teacher working in the education sector for the better part of a decade, before turning to New York and finding DecideNYC, which sought to school New Yorkers about their government and local politics. Ben, thank you so much for joining the 25th hour. It's an honor to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Dennis. Thanks for having me.
So it's been a month now since the new mayor started his job. And where are we on how his hires are reflective of his governing?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting and unfortunately tragedy-laced first month for Mayor Eric Adams. I think as we talk here at the end of January, you look back at this first month and it very likely would have been significantly different had two major tragedies not struck: the fire in the Bronx that killed at least 17 people, and then, of course, the killing of two NYPD officers in Harlem on a domestic call. Those two things have been such big tragedies and demanded so much attention of the mayor that it's been a very different first month than you would probably, quote unquote, normally see from a new mayor. Now, this is New York City, and tragedies and events strike all the time. And so none of this is some big surprise that he's dealing with these emergencies, but they've really dominated. And so, I think by way of answering your question, that context is really important because Eric Adams, I think, was moving along at a little bit of a slow pace in some of his appointments. And then I think those two major events and tragedies, among other things he's had to deal with or things he's felt he, really should show up at the scenes of a lot of other emergencies, have really, I think, slowed him down even a little bit more. So, he's appointed quite a few top officials, and we have a tracker of it at Gotham Gazette for anyone who wants to see the full list. But then there's, quite a few others that he hasn't named replacements. There's some acting commissioners. There's some holdover from the de Blasio years. There's some agencies where I'm not quite sure what's happening. And so, he's appointed a lot of, he's made a lot of seemingly smart appointments in terms of people with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, and people who, at least at this point, very early on, you have to assume are sort of ready and able to implement his vision. And then you have some major question marks. There's a few appointments that, we could get into the details where there's some, questions around if they were smart hires, if they're ethical hires, and so forth. And then we're really waiting on some other big ones. And I'll just name one in that last category, which is he hasn't named either a deputy mayor for housing or a top housing official in some way, shape, or form. And that's a really big one. So that's one of the biggest ones that I've been waiting to see, is who he would either name as deputy mayor for housing or some sort of top housing official in the administration.
Is there any indication that he's going to choose somebody in the near term?
There were some reports that he had made a decision, but then I think it's been at least a week since those reports, and he hasn't named anybody. So again, in that week, the two officers were shot. Both have now died. So, there's been so much going on with that, and it sped up his release of his anti-gun violence plan, which, and I said this on Twitter, given what Eric Adams ran on and the fact that we've pretty much known he's going to be mayor since he won the primary, which the results were tallied in July, the fact that he hadn't laid out a detailed gun violence plan yet, and that he was sort of spurred to release one quicker than he was planning 3 weeks or so into his mayoralty, raises some questions about exactly how he's, focused on following through on what he ran on. So there's been some talk about housing officials. He did finally name a leader of the city planning department, which is an important, adjacent sort of city agency for housing and economic development, but no top housing official yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, your answer leads me to my next question, and that is Adams' actions a harbinger of things to come? Now, for example, it seems like Mayor Eric Adams is comfortable in front of a camera. Some might say that he may be too comfortable with a little bit of the recent verbal gaffes that he's released, some mix-up as to calling, for example, his low-skilled workers comment has set some people off as well. And there are people even saying that he was victim blaming those who perished in the fire by saying that they didn't close their doors. You can correct me if I'm wrong there. But he, on the other hand, has hired an all-female deputy commissioner team, or am I mistaken in that? Or is it deputy mayor
almost
team?
all deputy mayors? Yeah, no, that's one of the areas. He named 5 women as deputy mayors, and he had a press conference, and he had a sort of a special thing where 5 sort of trailblazing, iconic New York political figures who are women introduced each of the 5 new deputy mayors who are women, and made sort of a significant gesture there. And then, though, much more quietly, he named a 6th deputy mayor, who is Philip Banks III, who is a former top NYPD official who has big clouds of scandal around him. And so he's got 6 deputy mayors now, the 5 women he announced, and then Banks, who announced his own appointment with a Daily News op-ed, and felt the need to do so because he had to address these major ethical issues that are clouding over him. And that's been one of the very iffy, questionable appointments of a small number. As I was saying, in my first comments, most of his appointments, the vast majority, are reputable, seemingly very smart, capable people. And then he's got a few where there's some big question marks. And even someone like Philip Banks, who's the deputy mayor for public safety, might be very smart and capable, but also has this sort of cloud of corruption and ethical issues from his time in the NYPD, where he resigned from the NYPD in 2014, retired as he was sort of caught up in this ethics scandal where he was an unindicted co-conspirator in a federal case. So, that appointment and a couple others are absolutely potential harbingers of things to come. Eric Adams, whether it's on things like this or some of the moments that you pointed to, and there have been others where he said things that have gotten some criticism, and these are both sort of part and parcel of who he is and who he's always been, which is he's someone who will sometimes misspeak, and sometimes he will not misspeak and say things that are kind of controversial. Sometimes it's not easy to tell which is which. And he also sort of plays a little bit by his own rules in terms of saying, hey, Philip Banks is someone I've known for a long time. He appointed his brother, the school's chancellor. He's known both those Banks brothers for a long time, and they've been friends and advisors. And he's, saying he's the one I think is the best for this job, and I'm gonna appoint him no matter what critics might say. So it's a little bit of all that, and then it's also quite a lot of making appointments that have been pretty roundly applauded, even though there's a few where people are raising questions. And I'll just finally say here, on a couple of those comments you pointed to, I think when he said low skill workers, as he later said, he misspoke. I think he probably did misspeak, or even if he meant low skill, I don't think he meant it in a derogatory way. And he's right that people sort of jumped all over him, as he called it, the word police. And this is an issue for Eric Adams because he's not a super scripted guy. And so sometimes he will say, he will make little gaffes. And, in the world we live in, those, blow up on social media, and it's not always fair.
Now, all of that is to then ask, are we judging him too quickly? I mean, especially in our 24/7 news environment where the latest tweet can become the biggest story for the day or two. Are we being too rough on a guy who just started his job a month out?
Well, I'm not sure that anybody is being so rough on him. I mean, there's definitely been some, as you know, as we were both just saying, there's been some sort of Twitter, storms around him, and mostly people on the left who didn't vote for him anyway and are skeptical of him, and that's fine. But I'm interested to, if you have further thoughts on what you mean by, people being too tough on him, because, I think he's gotten a lot of leeway. I think he's gotten, as almost every new mayor would, something of a honeymoon period. But at the same time, for the most part, of course, it's too early to judge him in most ways, but we can certainly judge some of the appointments based on the appointee's history. Philip Banks is undoubtedly, no matter who you are, should be a highly questionable appointment based on his past and what we have, well documented, sort of evidence and fact pattern on him in the past. Again, he was never charged with a crime, and that's what Mayor Adams says is his standard, apparently. But that should objectively to everyone be a highly questionable appointment. Another layer down from that, naming Frank Carone as his chief of staff at City Hall, who is a very sort of entangled figure in Brooklyn politics and Brooklyn legal work. Is not as serious of a question, I don't think, as the Phil Banks appointment, but it's another one where you scratch your head a little bit and you say, all right, Eric Adams is going with his allies and going with, people he's relied on a long time, and he prizes loyalty, but it's a questionable appointment. So those things we can judge a little bit, but we also have to see how those people perform. And then, we can judge somewhat how he responds to some of these emergencies, but we also have to let him, put forth his plans on the fire, for example. Everybody went, a lot of people went a little bit crazy on him about how he talked about, close the door. And people were saying that was victim blaming. If you listen to the full quote, he specifically said right after that, I am not trying to add trauma to the people who experienced this fire. I'm just making a larger point for all New Yorkers. But that got left out of a lot of the clips that people shared and the commentary. But at the same time, we also now need to see, when there's more information from the full investigation of the fire, how he handles whatever that shows. And if he's too friendly towards the landlords, then that'll be something to evaluate. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions before the investigation is over.
I hear you on that. And, it's interesting to me because sometimes it feels like members of the media, and I mean, especially politicians, those that want to take advantage of every misstep that Adams is taking, are quick to jump on his appointments. And there's also the entire controversy over his brother and whether the conflicts of interest board are going to weigh in on Eric Adams's favor when it comes to that. He did promise to go along with whatever the board is going to decide. And you also alluded to his appointments in places like housing. And I'm also interested in hearing what you know about his appointments, in terms of leadership and in terms of climate change. One of the biggest criticisms of Eric Adams during the primary was that he was relatively devoid of specific policies. You can correct me if I'm wrong there. And I think that's something that a lot of people are interested in hearing about, finding out whether he's getting more specific now that he's the guy in charge.
Yeah, I mean, these are really good. These are really good questions. So during the campaign, a lot of candidates put out very detailed plans on a lot of, almost every big category, right? And there's maybe a dozen of those. And, Sean Donovan, for example, tried to run on the fact that he had really detailed plans for everything. And he was like the government wonk and so forth. And then, Catherine Garcia wasn't too far behind that and so on. But Eric Adams, mostly released plans that were sort of outlines. They were sketches. Now, the thing is, people like me, maybe people like you, I don't know about, listeners, depending on who's listening, but, I love the detailed plans, right? And so do a lot of journalists and a lot of the sort of insidery folks. But Eric Adams was not running a campaign for the insidery folks. And it was reflected in that, and it was reflected in almost everything else he did. And so having super detailed policy plans in a campaign, I think, is a very debatable question around whether that's really important. If you lay out your big principles and your big vision, that's what you're, selling to your voters or to any voters who you're trying to have vote for you. And then when you are elected, or you're the presumptive next mayor, which he was as of July, as I was saying, and then you become mayor, it's really time to flesh out those plans, make your appointments, and really put out the details. And so one problem with not doing it during the campaign is then you have to do it, once you are the mayor, and, you have to do it anyway once you're the mayor, once you really get into the agencies and you make your appointments and they get to influence what the final outcomes are. But at least if you do it during the campaign, you have a more detailed playbook to work from. So we're maybe seeing a little bit of that trip him up. I do think it's really, it's pretty iffy that he didn't have the gun violence blueprint, as he calls it, really ready to go day one. And he had to kind of get it out there after this tragedy, among other gun violence incidents we've seen. On climate change, he laid out a plan during the campaign. Again, kind of broad strokes with, some subheadings, specifics therein. We haven't seen anything other than really the gun violence plan from him since becoming mayor. Like I said, there's been some big tragedies that have taken up a lot of his attention. But he really hasn't moved forward on climate and resiliency with any appointments or any new plans.
And we'll be looking out for your coverage as soon as he announces them. Now, to shift gears a tiny bit, I want to ask about Eric Adams' relationship with the governor, which is a big deal when it comes to what can get done on the city level. The past 8 years in New York City was in part defined by former Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio's rivalry. And now that we have Kathy Hochul and Eric Adams, their partnership seems to be off to a good start. So I want to ask you your judgment on how things look so far. And my second part of that question is, well, is all of that temporary?
Yeah, so far, Governor Hochul and Mayor Adams are pretty much in lockstep and haven't had a crossword for the other. There will probably at some point be some differences of opinion. One of the things we really need to see is what Mayor Adams has to say on February 9th when he testifies before the state legislature during the annual state budget hearing for mayors, and usually the New York City mayor goes first. And so that'll be an interesting hearing because the mayor goes before the state legislature and talks about the governor's budget proposal, which is already out, her executive budget, and about the mayor's own other priorities, whether they're policy or budgetary. And so that'll be very interesting. We already know on this gun violence plan that he's put forward ideas that he wants from Albany on changes to the bail law and changes to the raise the age law. And Governor Hochul has been very hesitant to really comment one way or another. The state legislative leaders have mostly said they're not really interested in those changes. But, so those are quickly potential areas of disagreement. I think probably no matter what, over the next at least 6 to 8 months, the relationship will stay very good. Governor Hochul is running for her first full term as governor in the June primary, and if she wins that in the November general election. So she wants to do everything she can to, please the mayor of New York City, please New York City voters, et cetera. So that'll be important. But, there will surely be things that come up. And, I'm waiting to see how they handle them. But I don't think anybody thinks they could possibly be handled worse than they were handled by Governor Cuomo and to some extent Mayor de Blasio. So I'm expecting this relationship to be solid, if not very good. I don't think it'll stay great, but we'll see.
I also think it's off to a good start. Just the two leaders are setting a really good tone when you see both of them at press conferences together, addressing important issues and not being at each other's throats. unlike their
Yeah.
predecessors. And, one interesting thing also on my mind is shifting to the governor's race for a moment, how Eric Adams is, I don't know, I guess you could call him friend. I'm not sure, Tom Suozzi, how Eric is going to go about putting his 2 cents into the governor's race, considering his relationship with Tom Suozzi and his need to have a amicable relationship with Kathy Hochul for the city.
So let me say one other quick thing about the Adams Hochul relationship. Hochul put in her executive budget a 4-year extension of mayoral control of New York City schools, which is expiring later this year. That's a huge sort of olive branch. Not that they needed it, but it's a huge sort of gift of sorts to Eric Adams, to a nod to say, I'm with you here. I don't want to mess with you for your whole first term. I want to give you mayoral control of schools. I don't want you to have to come back and ask the legislature for it, et cetera. Now, I don't know if he'll get that when the final deal is done. The legislature might want to do 2 years or 3 years, whatever. But, that's another indicator that she is absolutely trying to, have a good relationship with him and the blend of policy and politics and such. On the governor's race, Adams is obviously a huge figure, winning in New York City and winning in communities of color in New York City, which is how Adams, won the mayoralty for the most part, is very important to the gubernatorial primary and general election. And so, Representative Suozzi, he represents a little bit of Queens and a chunk of Long Island. And he's, he was an early supporter of Eric Adams and was, Eric Adams apparently tried to get Tom Suozzi to become a deputy mayor or first deputy mayor or something. And Suozzi, decided not to. So I highly, highly doubt, could be wrong. Obviously it's politics, it's bad to make predictions. So I'll just give you my sort of educated estimate. I highly doubt that Eric Adams will endorse Tom Suozzi for governor. Doing that to Governor Hochul would be a major insult. Also, Suozzi is a major underdog in the primary. Hochul's got a lot more money, and the early polling, it's very early still, but the polling shows her to be a heavy favorite. So I would imagine that Eric Adams will just totally stay out of the primary. And if he does anything, I would guess that he would just back the incumbent governor. I don't even know if Suozzi stays in the full primary. There's also public advocate Jumaane Williams, who's a fellow Brooklyn Democrat like the mayor. So that's another reason that I would guess that Adams would just stay out. I don't think he wants to insult public advocate Williams either. So, Suozzi, of course, would love to have Eric Adams's endorsement. He's probably lobbying hard for it, but I doubt it'll come. And, it will take some major things to shift for Suozzi to get the type of momentum that would make Adams, I think more about it. But Adams, is a loyal guy. And so we'll see.
And no hard feelings, Tom. I mean, it is politics. And so I also now want to shift gears and talk about COVID. It's impossible to forget about, especially when we're trying to look forward into this year. People are exhausted for sure. Eric Adams has signaled his enthusiasm with returning the city workers back to their offices. What can we expect when it comes to COVID in this new year?
Well, part of the issue with COVID is that we really often don't know. So, a few things I again can kind of sort of estimate or guess is, it seems like we're coming out of the Omicron wave. I think there's a lot to be seen as to how easily and how well we come out of it. But if we're on the down slope again from another wave, and given that the vaccination, numbers are pretty strong, I think we could have a real good stretch of improvement, and more and more people going back to schools and offices and other places of work, and see a real, bit of a boom. I just don't know to what extent it'll happen. I don't know to what extent companies are really trying to get their workers back. I don't know how much Eric Adams will be able to use the bully pulpit to, push that forward. I don't know exactly what's going to happen with some of the vaccine mandates and, the mask mandates, and all these things are very hard to predict exactly where they're going to go and for how long they're going to last. One of the most interesting things I'm watching is whether the new mayor will really make a big push to try to get the vaccination numbers up in demographics where they're still low. And, I've been a little bit surprised that even when he was the presumptive mayor, then when he was mayor-elect, and now when he's mayor, I'm a little surprised he hasn't put more effort toward that. Overall, the city's vaccination numbers are very good, but there's still a number of subgroups of demographic groups where they are not that good. And so, I think that's important again for the city's future, health, economy, and so forth. And then the other thing is on the schools, Adams and his chancellor have said, they're sort of reconsidering how much of remote learning to allow or to offer, because there's a couple 100,000 kids who aren't going to school every day.
Right.
And that's a huge challenge for him. And I think, again, that would be something that would be even more of a focus if we hadn't had these two major tragedies. But that's something where he's got to figure out the path ahead. And you can't just wait till the next school year to require, COVID vaccinations for the kids or some other big step like that. You have to sort of deal with the here and now. So that's another thing on COVID I'm sort of watching closely.
And for Adams and Banks, is it when it comes to the temporary remote schooling, I think now that they've shifted into that viewpoint, is it more for them to avoid more catastrophic effects in learning results, or is it to assuage parents who are just freaking out about what's happening with schools and having to worry about taking a day off to, make sure their kids are on Zoom, for example? Do you have any sense of what it's really more about? Is it all of the above?
Well, all they've done so far is allow schools and teachers to provide, continue to provide some online learning activities, but to sort of take attendance that way. And if kids are doing those activities, they can be marked present. And so it's almost a little bit of a way to sort of encourage a little bit more of that online communication between teachers and parents and kids who are home, and also get the attendance numbers up, because those have looked pretty bad. Now they have ticked up in the last week or so, and that's pretty encouraging, but I don't know how much of that is because now kids are being marked present for doing some of the online learning. The online learning is still for the most part not some sort of live instruction. It's not a lot of Zoom activity. The teachers union has been very against live streaming lessons, and there's a lot of good reasons for that, but that's also very debatable, of course. I think they lean a little bit more in that direction, in part to get the attendance numbers up so it doesn't look as bad as it still probably is, and also to sort of encourage a little bit more engagement with the kids that are not coming in the hopes that can then improve the prospects for getting them into the buildings. But as I was saying a couple minutes ago, I think it's a very bad situation that probably hasn't gotten enough attention, that there's basically a couple 100,000 kids who are just not going to school buildings every day. And there doesn't seem to be a real plan in place. And it gets into very, very tricky territory about remote learning, about the teachers union and live streaming instruction, about, we have compulsory education in this country for a reason. Kids are supposed to go to school. But then rightfully most people don't want, the child welfare agency knocking on all the parents' doors who are not sending their kids to school. So it gets very, very tricky. And I think the mayor needs to address it a bit more.
And in the interest of time, we're going to move on to other topics. I feel like I could ask you questions about this all day. Now, New York City and transportation, two intertwined things. Now, Governor Hochul came out recently with a new vision for an interborough express linking Bay Ridge with Queens. Other neighborhoods like the Bronx have complained that they're being forgotten about on the transportation side of policymaking. So, what can we expect this year in terms of progression in city transportation?
Well, the governor's interborough express idea is, I think, by virtually all accounts, except for maybe some people who live along the proposed route who, may be disrupted or not want the extra traffic or construction or whatever, is almost universally applauded thus far. But that's going to take years, right? But that is the type of big thinking and big planning that New York City needs. New York City clearly needs, and the state obviously has a role in this, especially on things like transit and climate. But New York City needs some really big thinking and as fast as possible advancement in a big way on issues like transit and housing and climate, and probably lots of others too. But those three are really interconnected and in need of some major plans and major movement. So there's big projects that take years, but those, of course, should be outlined and should get going as long as they're good ones. And New York needs to figure out a way to get them built less costly. But beyond that, in the more near term, to your question, I'm waiting to see from Mayor Adams and his transportation commissioner, Ydanis Rodriguez, who was just recently a city council member, more of their transit plan, the things they can control, the bus lanes, the busways, things like that, to see what their real vision is and what they're trying to move ahead this year. And beyond that, there's some other sort of tinkering around the edges, but in terms of what you can do sort of quickly, a lot of it's the buses. There's obviously city bike expansion, and that's important too, and more bike lanes and pedestrian safety and such. But in terms of really moving, lots of people, the buses, are really a lot of where it's at. And I'm interested to see what Mayor Adams is going to do on that.
And now in the battle of views between defunders and the Blue Stripe crowd, it seems that Adams's victory as mayor stamped out cries for reshaping the police department's funding. And we still have yet to hear, I think, more from the progressive wing of the city council and how they feel about this. But as Adams announced the return of a clandestine police force following the high-profile police shootings from last week, are we already saying bye to those who would like to see less money in one police plaza's coffers?
Yeah, pretty much.
Ouch, right in the gut.
Listen, there's a couple things. One, New York City and New York State have so much money right now because of federal relief and because tax returns have come in higher than expected. The pandemic had this awful disproportionate impact on lower income people and communities where the health impacts and of course the socioeconomic impacts have all been so much more severe in lower income communities. So on the sort of economic side and the fiscal side, while we still have this like really problematic unemployment situation in the city because of so many jobs in retail and hospitality and restaurants and tourism that were lost and haven't come back yet, those are so disproportionately lower income jobs that the overall tax picture for the city and state have been pretty solid for the most part. There's some big questions about real estate taxes, and those will also remain here. And that'll be very interesting to watch. But the fiscal picture, when you combine the fact that the tax returns have been stronger than expected, plus this massive, massive federal aid that's come in multiple packages, the city has a ton of money. So there's some questions about long-term fiscal questions and such, but there's so little belt tightening that really has to happen that the arguments around NYPD funding continue to sort of remain the same, which is much more about philosophy and policy and, the left wing saying more police is not how you really get at long-term safety. And you see in Eric Adams's gun violence plan, he's got a mix of all of it. But I don't expect him to look to reduce police department funding. And not only did progressives, lose the mayoral race, but, Adrienne Adams, the new city council speaker, sort of straddles the line, but she was not a defunder. She was not, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago when the big city budget battle happened around the time of the major Black Lives Matter protests and the George Floyd protests. She was not someone who was among those calling for a huge, shifting of NYPD funds. So as a leader of the city council, she's unlikely to do it. Are there small areas where, the mayor and the speaker and members of the city council might agree that there's room for moving some NYPD funds somewhere else? Probably, but I would imagine any of that would actually be reallocated to different, uses within the NYPD. So as you said, I'm very interested to see how the progressive sort of caucus of the city council makes its voice heard and what the budget battles look like over the next 6 months. But, I don't see any major movement in that direction, given that Eric Adams is the mayor, given that gun violence has remained significantly up from where it was in 2019, and, sort of the national and local atmospheres around this stuff.
Now, is there even a potent force pushing back against Eric Adams? Is this something that he has to worry about when it comes to the progressive wing of the city council? I think we saw early on kind of what may happen with the issue of solitary confinement. And he promised to go ahead and push forward anyway with his plan to, I believe, keep solitary confinement or at least override de Blasio's rules. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's a little more complicated than that because de Blasio actually, in part because of state law that was passed, the city's been on a path towards ending solitary confinement, but there's this sort of middle ground system of what's called punitive segregation, which is not as severe as solitary confinement, but depending on how you design it, some people and organizations would still call it solitary confinement. If you, move it more towards a little bit more of a sort of liberal separation of people within the jails, maybe you can categorize it in a somewhat middle ground, which is what Eric Adams is sort of saying he's going to do. But also it's important to note that de Blasio had issued executive orders to hold off on that transition because things have been so bad at Rikers Island. So it's very complicated. Eric Adams is promising that people who are violent in the city's jails can be separated under punitive segregation that is not in a inhumane fashion. But there's some people who say even his design for a more humane separation it still amounts to a form of inhumane treatment and a form of torture. So there's a lot of debate that's going to happen over that. I do think that's absolutely, one good example, as is NYPD funding, of where we're going to see what the city council looks like. I don't have a great sense of where the sort of tipping point in the council is. It's a very diverse council in every way, virtually, except, not Democrat, Republican, really. It's 46 Democrats and 5 Republicans. But, there's a lot of gradations among those Democrats. And so I'm eager to see on a number of issues exactly where the council winds up going. There definitely is a sizable sort of further left group, but it's nowhere near a majority. And on some issues, though, even, like solitary confinement, punitive segregation, the speaker, Adrienne Adams, who's a little bit more of a moderate, has a lot of progressive views. She might side with the quote unquote progressives, and she's going to probably straddle a line a bit depending on where, some sort of swing group that's a little bit in the middle of the moderates and the progressives, where they go. And it's going to be issue by issue, I think.
Now, we're just about up with our time here with you, Ben. So I think I'm going to go ahead and try to ask you this question and wrap this up in a nice, pretty bow. If we were to write a story now about New York City, as the late Mayor Dinkins said, it's a beautiful mosaic. What is the running theme now for 2022 going to be based on what you're hoping, your predictions? What would you say is the next chapter in New York City?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a gorgeous mosaic was the Dinkins quote.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. So, listen, I think for the most part, 2022 is about, what the last 2 years have mostly been about, which is COVID, the COVID recovery. Now that touches a lot of things, but given this Omicron wave, given the fact that we have all these mandates, people are still wearing masks, all over the place at schools, Broadway shows, you name it. That all says that this is not over by any means. So I think that's going to be, as of right now, looking ahead, the story of 2022 in New York City politics is what's the path ahead on COVID recovery, and overlaid with that, how does Mayor Adams do in his first year? What is he able to accomplish on COVID recovery and the many, sort of tentacles related to that, and improving the city in the ways that he promised to, whether it's public safety, which is obviously number one, but also jobs in the economy, setting forward a affordable housing plan and getting that in motion. And then you can go through the other categories, and they all have relationships with COVID in some way, right? COVID has impacted everything. So I think it's really about that theme again, and those question marks around, what the city's COVID recovery will look like, going forward here, and how the new mayor will do on that, and so many other things.
And that's it with Ben Max, executive editor of the Gotham Gazette and host of the Max Politics podcast. If our listeners want to venture out and start following someone who is up to date with what's happening in New York City, I would say by the second, go ahead and subscribe to Ben's Twitter feed, follow him, and subscribe to his podcast, as well as become a subscriber and supporter of the Gotham Gazette. Ben, I want to thank you so much for spending a little bit of your time with us.
Dennis, thanks for having me, and thanks for throwing your hat into this world, and and launching this new venture, and I'm glad to join you in chat, and thanks for all the questions and for having me on.
Thank you, Ben.